what I want to kick off with is just a quick introduction to Risk Ledger and why these reports have come about and what we're going to do on this event. So hopefully, given that you have signed up to the event, you do know a bit about what Risk Ledger does. So we've developed a platform that helps companies to manage third-party or supply chain risks across their supply chain. We act as a data pipe. So we basically make it easy for security teams to talk to each other and share data. And what that does, and this is what is really relevant to the reports, it gives us a great insight into how security risk controls are being implemented across the supply chain ecosystem. And at the moment, we have just over 1,000 suppliers on the Risk Ledger platform who are sharing sort of due diligence risk data with their clients. And those suppliers span from the likes of Nokia, LinkedIn, BP, Lloyd's Bank, right down to small sort of two-men in a shed operations who are doing supplying some service to clients that are using the Risk Ledger platform. What we've tried to do, so that the platform operates around a standardized supply assessment framework. And that framework is made up of 12 risk domains. And the two risk domains that we're focusing on today are IT operations and network and cloud security. And actually, we've seen in regulations in the past year or two from both the Bank of England, the PRA, and the EBA in Europe, the European Banking Authority, that particularly network and cloud security is one that they're really focused on when it comes to outsourcing and third-party risk management. That's particularly for the financial sector, but we've seen through the number of supply chain breaches that have taken place over the last year that is a big issue for all industries. So from each of those domains, what we've done is taken the responses that suppliers have actually provided themselves, and they tend to provide evidence and context around each of their responses. And we've aggregated and anonymized that data to turn them into these reports that I've shared on the chat. So for those of you who have just joined, I've shared 2 reports in the chat that you can look at and that are relevant to our discussion today. And what I want to kick off with is just a quick look at some of the insights that we found in those reports that will give context to the panel discussion that's going to take place later on in the event. I think the numbers have slowed down. We've got a couple of people that I'll let join the event now. But I'm going to share my screen now. I will start with the IT operations report, which was published towards the end of last month. So if you just give me a moment. You should now be able to see my screen and the front page of that report. So we kicked off with a bit of a comment by Emily, who's joining our panel today. She's our in-house security consultant at Risk Ledger. And I won't go through the opening remarks that she gave, but what Emily tried to do was give some context to what this means as a whole. One of the interesting things that I found as we put together these reports is that you can look at each individual control that organizations have, but it's really important to take a step back and look at those controls as a whole. What do the trends mean? And particularly for third-party risk managers, what does it mean that you have to do to sort of remediate or take other actions to ensure that your organization is secure from supply chain breaches? So 3 of the highlights that I'll start with from the IT operations report. The first one was that 1 in 4 organizations don't enforce passwords on their employees' mobile devices or have the ability to remotely wipe those compromised devices, despite allowing employees to access company sensitive data on those devices. Now, I pulled that one out as a highlight because we all know, obviously, over the last 18 months, there's been a lot of remote working. And actually, if you think about how those lockdowns came into place, teams had sort of less than a week to go to get their employees remote and to set that up for them. And so we know that there has been a spike in the use of mobile devices and accessing company data on those devices. But what we saw in this report was that 26% of organizations haven't then implemented the mobile device management policies and technical controls that you might imagine they would do to protect that company data on those mobile devices. And I think in the panel discussion later, we'll look at what that means for third-party risk managers. The second highlight, 1 in 5 organizations are running applications or systems that are no longer supported with security updates by the manufacturer. So for those of you who run IT departments, you run security teams, you work in them, you know how difficult it actually is to run an effective and up-to-date patch management process, but we thought that this was still quite high. So 20% of organizations knowingly run applications that are no longer supported. And everyone on the call may have seen the news recently that Internet Explorer is about to go that way very soon as well. And then finally, another highlight that we saw in this report was that over a quarter of organizations have not implemented TLS email security. And that means that the content of their email communications and any sensitive information that's shared in them is unencrypted and can be accessed by sort of unauthorized third parties if they've made an effort to do so. And we split this report into a few sections that were relevant in the IT operations space. So patch management, asset management, authentication, identity and access management, email security, mobile device management, encryption, and operational security. And I'm just going to quickly whiz through some of the stats that we pulled out there. But before I do that, I want to just sort of reiterate what I mentioned earlier in terms of the types of suppliers who are on the Risk Ledger platform sharing data with their clients to give you an understanding of the kind of broad range of industries, sizes, but also the very big names that are using the platform to share this data. So we say that because we've got this sort of 1,000+ suppliers on the platform, that the data and the statistics that we've pulled from the platform can be seen as a really good indication of what's happening across the wider supply chain ecosystem. So we very much talk about in all of these stats organizations in general, because we think that the 1,000+ organizations are good sample size. So I've mentioned already the 20% of organizations who knowingly run applications and systems that are no longer supported. And but if we look to the next control, does the organization ensure that all IT systems used are regularly patched with security patches in line with the vendor recommendations? This was also a relatively high number. And I know in Emily's opening to the report, she discussed that it's difficult, and I think everyone on the call will appreciate it's difficult to ensure that all systems are regularly patched. But you definitely, as a third-party risk manager, want to be exploring what your suppliers are doing to ensure that they're doing the best that they can, and that certainly when security patches are released, that they have at least a timeline to get those implemented as soon as possible, particularly the ones that are considered to be critical vulnerabilities. And I was drawn towards something that the NCSC says, that patching remains the single most important thing that organizations can do to secure their technology. So it's kind of the basics of IT operations, but as we can see there, 20% are still using as systems and applications that are not supported, and 12% say that they don't actually regularly patch their systems. I was really drawn also to the next statistic, which is that there's a question that's asked on our standardized assessment is, does your organization keep an up-to-date inventory of all data repositories, such as databases, with assigned owners? And the comment that we made here was that it's very difficult to secure data if you're not sure where it is. And we do acknowledge that shadow IT can be a problem, particularly in large organizations, but we thought 19% was relatively high for organizations to say that they actually don't have an up-to-date inventory. And that has various implications for some of the other controls further down in the report. When it comes to protecting that data, it's very difficult to do if you're not actually sure where that is. It was a much better result, as you can see below, on the inventory of IT hardware assets, and potentially the move to remote working, the buying of laptops for employees, and sort of digital transformation projects over the last 18 months has helped that number to be as low as possible. So I won't go on too much because I don't want to steal the thunder of the panel later on, but I have shared this report on the chat, so do have that open, ready to take part in the discussion with our panel later on. I'm going to scroll down quickly to the identity and access management controls, because I think that this is also one that has become very relevant during the pandemic. Obviously, unfortunately, there's been lots of turnover in employees and staff at organizations. And so I think this is when the controls and processes that organizations have in place to manage identity and access management have become really important. And I think we saw some worrying statistics. So when we look at the provision and removal of accounts for all IT services that secure log on with a unique user IDs, we can see that. Sorry, mix up there. So we can see that if there isn't a documented process that allows companies to provision and remove user accounts, then actually in the turmoil of a pandemic with remote working, people leaving, some people joining, there's actually a lot of user accounts that might end up slipping through the cracks and laying dormant. And I think my colleague Emily will discuss later on how that can leave accounts that are open for attackers to take advantage of if they can find or steal the access details for those user accounts. And I'm going to scroll down to the mobile device management section that I spoke about earlier, because I think this is highly relevant, and it's not just relevant to the pandemic. I think it's relevant going forward as employees and companies, a wider range of devices to do their work, and people are on the go more and potentially working from home more for the foreseeable future. If we look at the second control on the page at the moment, does your organization control the use of mobile phone using mobile device management software, which enforces a password policy for all devices? 40% of respondents said no. And that we found that to be a really high number. There are a number of good services out there that can help organizations to do that. And what that means, to say it very clearly, is that if employees are accessing company data on their mobile devices, even if it is just emails that contain sensitive information, without that mobile device management software that enforces a password, if that device is lost or compromised, so is that data. So we can see really clearly how what might seem a small risk control can turn into actually quite serious as data breaches over time. So please do have a look at the file that I've shared on the chat. So that's the IT operations report. I'm going to switch now onto the report that we've actually just, you're getting basically the first preview of this report. It was released this morning. before I do that, I'm actually going to stop sharing to just check whether there are any questions or issues on that front. No, it doesn't look like it. Excellent. I'll carry on. So, as I mentioned, this is a network and cloud security insight report that we've developed and published this morning. And as I mentioned at the top, regulators and authorities are really interested in this risk domain when it comes to critical national infrastructure organizations. They look particularly at sort of concentration risks amongst in the supply chain ecosystem, and how sort of digital service providers can actually end up becoming critical national infrastructure themselves, because they are supplying such critical services across the economy. And we was really pleased that George Thompson, who's also going to be on our panel later today, gave a foreword to this report. And George really talks about here where there are some positive trends. He was pleased to see that so 80% of organizations have some sort of detective controls in place to monitor for intrusions, and 3/4 of them report that they conduct vulnerability scans and penetration testing to provide assurance over their controls. And what we talk about later on in the report is where you have sort of 20 to 25% of organizations who don't have some of these controls in place, and what does that mean for them, and then also what does that mean for their clients and third-party risk managers who are trying to decide how they operate with these third parties. So I'll just cover the highlights on this one, because we're 20 minutes in and I want to get the panel discussing. Nobody wants to listen to me talking forever. So some of the highlights that I pulled out: 37% of organizations do not implement web application firewalls to protect their critical web applications. So I'm not going to go into the details of WAFs, but what this means is that there are applications out there that could actually that are not being protected by some sort of a firewall at all, and we think that that is an issue, particularly if those web applications are relevant to clients and their or are public-facing applications. On to the next one. On 1 out of 5 organizations don't implement any network monitoring controls, such as intrusion detection systems, intrusion prevention systems, or security information and event management systems. And we think that this is an issue because actually we're in an environment where everyone be sensible to assume that at some point there will be an attack and a breach in the organization that you work at. And actually George's point in his foreword is, how do you sort of identify and recover from that breach? So for those 20% of organizations who don't have any of those systems in place, it's going to be difficult or slower for them to sort of identify what's going on and try to defend against it and then recover from it. And actually later on, I'm really trying to get some of George's expertise. He's working at Travelex now, and many of you will know Travelex did suffer a really devastating breach earlier last year now, and also has experience at other companies where he's helped them to recover from significant cyber attacks. And the final highlight that I'll cover now is that what we've tried to do in some of these reports is combine some of the controls. So really look at, okay, if an organization doesn't have this control, do they have another control that maybe is a layer that they can rely on? Or actually, is there a complete gap? And in this case, we found that 14% of organizations do not place all publicly accessible services in isolated network DMZs, or demilitarized zones, as they're termed, or separate subnets, and they've not implemented any internal network segmentation or segregation. And what that means is that so publicly accessible services tend to be the services that receive the most attacks, because they are facing the internet and they're easier to reach for attackers. But if they are not placed in DMZs and then also internal networks aren't segmented or segregated, it means that a breach of those publicly accessible services can very quickly escalate to a breach of internal networks and some of the most sensitive networks and data within the organization. So you can see there clearly where having that holistic view of a variety of controls that are implemented by your third parties can really give you a good sense of whether they are resilient to a cyber attack, and as a knock on whether your supplier and what you rely on them for is resilient to a cyber attack as well. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen there now. Sorry, one person said they can't access the file. I will send that to you directly. And I'm going to invite Emily, George, and Tony to put their cameras on and turn their mics on, so that they can discuss what is covered in those reports more fully, and actually look at the what next. Okay, so it's great getting that data, and it's actually that data is quite unique. Not many people will be able to give you that control by control data that the Risk Ledger platform can provide. But once you do get that, if you're lucky enough to have that data, what should organizations be doing next? And I can assure you that they will be giving you a lot more security expertise than I am able to do as I covered those reports. So actually, Emily, if I can hand over to you first. I won't look at a specific report because obviously you've shadowed both reports. Can you sort of kick us off with your initial thoughts when you look through some of the percentages and statistics that we've managed to pull out from the platform?
Yeah, of course. Perhaps just a quick introduction. So I'm Risk Ledger's in-house security expert. I've got a background in cybersecurity consulting, starting with PwC in the Big Four world and also independently. So yeah, looking through these reports, I think they paint a relatively good picture. It's nice to see that roughly, if you're averaging out, it's around 80% do have the controls we expect. But that does leave that 1 in 5, 20% that don't have these. And I think we need to be focusing on how do we support those organizations that don't have these controls to improve their maturity, to get up to the level that you would expect and you would want from a supplier to your business. There's a lot of context that you can't see in top-level statistics that you would need to delve into. So as a third-party risk manager, I would be looking to have those discussions with my suppliers, really understand what their business is, what service they're providing to me, and why they've answered the way they have for different types of controls. Because it might be that even though they've answered no to a control, it might be that that control is less relevant to me. It might be that control doesn't actually pose a huge risk to me. It might be that it's also not very relevant to that business. So you've got different risk levels depending on the organization. You've got the risk to the organization that has answered that question, the supplier themselves, and they may well want to look at it in a different way or improve their maturity for their own sake. But then you've got the knock-on risk to the organization who is receiving those services, the organization that is the client to that organization. And there you really have to look at perhaps the data that supplier is holding for you, the service they're providing. Do they have any access into your network? How easily could a breach in your supplier organization transfer to a breach within your organization? So it's that context, that discussion that I think is really important here when we're looking at these statistics, not to draw too many conclusions from the statistics themselves, but to use them as a basis for that discussion, opening the communication channels and really helping each other to increase the security maturity across the whole global supply chain.
Thanks, Emily, and yeah, thank you for introducing yourself, Tony, and George. Please do when you talk first. Can I just turn to Tony first? So, Tony, you're at Northumbrian Water. You're looking at supply chains as a risk. Can you give your sort of perspective as an organisation? I guess we can say sort of medium size, not a big international corporate, but not a small company that's really got managing a critical service in terms of distribution of water. What's your context, or how do you look at those insights from the report?
Yeah, I'm Tony Smith, and I'm responsible for all aspects of cybersecurity at Northumbrian Water. And I cut my teeth years back to trying to protect us from foreign state at the end of the Cold War, working in the Air Force on cryptography systems. So everything seems to have come full circle when it comes to what I'm trying to protect anyway at Northumbrian Water, which is particularly the distribution and production of clean water. But we've got 4.5 million customers on there. The whole GDPR element is so important. There's the financial side of things as well, the business. And our supply chain touches every single part of what we do. Understanding where we are and what the threat level is so important. As Emily said, it's different levels of importance with different organizations, depending on what the data is, what we're doing. So getting into the nuts and bolts of where we see those risks is really important. But one overarching area, I guess, that does apply to all of us is if those supply chains do get compromised, the email compromise, where they're pretending to be the supply chain to trick us. A lot of large organizations have very good controls in place, and probably a bit harder to compromise than the supply chain, particularly the smaller organizations. So that is a target that we're seeing on a regular basis. So all we have to do really now is extend our own controls out to make sure our supply chain are doing what we would do. And if they're not a case of challenging them in a threatening way, it's education, because some of these organizations that don't fully appreciate what the risks are, they don't fully appreciate your organization and where your risks are, and it's a great place to strike up those conversations.
Thanks, Tony, and George. You've done a number of different roles. You've been on all sides of the fence when it comes to the supply chain security challenge. Can you give us your perspective of from you really focus on sort of recovery, so what it means to, okay, there's these controls in place, but we all know that the attackers are trying hard, and eventually they might get through. What does that mean for a third-party risk manager, and what they should be doing given this data and what it says about the controls that are in place? What should a third-party risk manager be preparing for to deal with some of those threats?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really great question. So I'm George Thompson. Been around security for about 30 years, IBM, KPMG, PwC, and like Emily, been independent consultant for about 5 years, and helped out a few organizations to get themselves back on their feet following breaches and so on. I think going back to Emily's point, you need to understand the context of what the suppliers are providing for you, and actually even understanding your own context and your own controls. You're not going to be secure. You're not going to be able to defend yourself by being able to put a tick against every control on the assessment or against standards. You really need to grab the mix of risks, impacts, and potential controls for you. So I was interested, for example, actually, that you said, for the NCSC, the single most important control is patching. For many organizations where there's, lots of legacy around, pretty much that's not, something they can do very, very easily. So you've got to look at the broader context of compensating controls. So if you live with vulnerabilities on your servers, what do you have to do to provide some alternative security. So things like putting in detection, tooling, segregating, as you pointed out from the network report, having really good response systems. But even more importantly, being able to recover effectively is, I think, becoming kind of the encapsulating security question in the supply chain. My kind of attitude is that sooner or later we're all going to get hacked. Sooner or later we're all going to have to recover in some way. So the key question is, particularly in the supply chain, where you're relying on the service from the supplier, what would be the impact of that supplier not being able to provide that service, and how long can you live with it? So we're moving, merging security with a business continuity type discussion, and linking the security controls to protecting availability and protecting integrity, as well, of course. We've got to honour the GDPR, the confidentiality and privacy things as well. So I think it's just moving the mindset to say, what would cause this suppliers to not be able to provide the service we rely on? And therefore, that's probably where my top 20 or 30 controls focus should be.
To pick up on that, so when we look at sort of some of those combinations that I spoke about of controls, so one of the examples was the lack of mobile device management that enforces a password, while also many more organizations are allowing employees to sort of access company data, also sensitive data. And maybe Tony, you could answer this one first. When you look at that, and if you see a supplier who lacks those two controls together, it means that they may well be emailing around your company's sensitive data between unprotected devices. What's your next step? Because we know that one of the challenges for third-party risk managers is actually getting suppliers to then remediate issues that are found. What's your instinctive reaction to that?
Yeah, it's through account management where those conversations need to happen. I'm just seeing a couple of questions in the chat there as well, and it's not just a case of the security team getting your thousands of suppliers to do this. You need to engage with whoever's managing those suppliers and let them know the importance of it. Everybody in your business, like, they need to know about health and safety. They need to know about cybersecurity as well. So if they understand what the implications are, if one of their supply chain left their mobile phone on the bus, or it got stolen and there was no passwords on it, what carnage could they cause? It's not just a case of stolen data. They could also, if they've got email addresses in there, they could cause more problems, which we won't sort of go into. And it covers the whole raft of things. I recently had a conversation with, it was a combination of our procurement people and operations people, because I was saying we need to get controls in place for every company that we do business with, even if they're coming to pick up skips. So we, there's a lot of muck comes out of raw water, it goes in skips and then it gets moved away. We get chemicals delivered. What happens if those companies that you traditionally don't think of as part of the IT sort of chain get compromised? It means you kind of get your chemicals delivered. It means you kind of get your rubbish removed. If their systems go down, and you can slowly start to see the cogs in their brains click and think, these companies, regardless of what they are, they all work on computer systems, and they've all got to have their systems in a secure way. So building the relationship between our internal people in the business who don't really have much to do with IT, and then having that conversation with the account manager as well. That, again, from the question at the side, and sorry, Emily, because you might be going in this, because I think the questions was directed at you, needs to come down from the top, and you need to have those conversations with all the senior managers and say, look, this isn't just my responsibility. When you're going out and you're doing procurement, at the first stage, you need to make sure that these checks and balances, are in there. Most of us have had relationships with some of these companies for decades in some instances, and that's where the difficult part is, because you cannot award the contract because they're already there, they're embedded within your system. And that's where the relationships work. Relationships is so important within cybersecurity, you know, and encouraging them. And I had a conversation with one of our supply chain yesterday about where they had a bit of a gap, and I sort of explained to them it was a bit of a, from their perspective, not just the security element, but they could use it to their advantage for winning more business as well. If they're seen as being secure in, you know, the cyber arena, the more people are going to go with them. It's something they should promote themselves and try and sell. And again, it's just winning hearts and minds. Ultimately, there's the stick. If they don't want to do it, then you move supplier, you go somewhere else, because number one priority is looking after your own business.
Thanks, Tony, and I'm really pleased to see 2 questions in the chat. We will get to those very soon. But Emily, Tony touched on some really important points that are highly relevant to Risk Ledger. So it's the collaborative approach to trying to secure supply chains that I find really interesting, and it seems is going to be a really powerful force to actually trying to defend against supply chain attacks. And there's a couple of collaborations. So Tony mentioned actually working within the organizations with procurement and others. So it would be really interesting to get your perspective, having sort of advised clients in previous lives about how to run these programs. But then there's the collaboration, as Tony talked about, with suppliers, and then actually on the Risk Ledger platform, sort of, I think it's about four or five water companies are actually on Risk Ledger reviewing similar suppliers. So there's also then a cross-industry collaboration that is possible, particularly with a tool like Risk Ledger. So it'd be really great to get your views on how all 3 of those sort of dynamics can work towards defending against supply chain attacks.
Yeah, this collaboration point is something that I think people are becoming much more open to, much more aware of. It's been a couple of industry discussions I've joined recently where, particularly following the SolarWinds breach last year, we're realizing the importance of information sharing cross organization rather than just in between organization or just with organizations you have direct relationships with. So this cross-industry, either within your industry or across other industries, sharing that kind of threat intelligence information about attacks you're seeing, and even kind of best practice learning about how to implement good controls, good security. I think we're all on the same side. We all acknowledge that, and it's getting over those kind of commercial competitive barriers to help us all create a more secure environment, ecosystem to do good business and to perform the services we want to do. And in security, we often get wrapped up in our own little world. We talk to each other a lot, but we forget about that context. We forget about what we're really trying to do. And I think even in 2 competing businesses, you would agree that you don't really want either of these businesses to be attacked. On the surface level, you can think, okay, it'd be great if my competitors get taken down and then I can take over. But in reality, if your competitors are getting hit, you're also being targeted because you're the same industry, similar business. So it's not something that's in anybody's interest to happen. And I think with the large scale supply chain breaches we've had over the last 6 months or so, people are starting to realize that. So people are starting to have those conversations. We don't, as an industry, I don't think we've quite got it figured out on how we do that, how we share this information whilst also keeping the trust that's there and being able to trust that if we share information with each other, it's not going to be used against us. It's not going to leak out to get some negative press from it or leak out to be useful to attackers. Because there's a lot of nervousness, and we see this from the Risk Ledger perspective. There's nervousness around sharing security information, uploading policies, sharing with your clients what your vulnerabilities might be, because there's a worry that if that gets into the wrong hands, that gets into the attacker hands, that's then easier to breach the organization. And it's a valid worry, but I think it's something we need to overcome. We need to find ways of sharing that comfortably so that we can help to build each other up in security rather than keeping our own little castle safe and not helping anybody else, because we're never going to improve in that way.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to touch on the question that came in the chat, because this accountability question is a really interesting, a really good question. And it's something that's difficult. And it's difficult because it's all about how do you manage people? How do you get the people to do what you need them to do within your organization? And I always say that the technical security is easy in comparison to what you have to do in order to get your organization to behave in the ways you need them to, have the right accountability structures. I think it's improving. I think if you took, say, 5-10 years ago, it was very much the opinion that security is responsible for security. Now, and the comment around digital as well in the chat, it's understood that the entire business is working in a digital world, even if the business is not a digital business. It's understood that security is important. Everybody now knows what cybersecurity is to some extent or another, whereas 5-10 years ago they didn't. So that is getting better, but I completely agree that it's not there yet. There is still a lot of pressure put on security teams. And often in large organizations, your security team might be 5, 10, 50 people compared to thousands of people in the business, or other people in the organization. So mobilizing them to have those initial conversations, to identify risks that can then be escalated to security, for not to hand off that responsibility, but for support in dealing with that responsibility. That's where I think I've seen it work really well, is when you've got the security team as kind of an advisory function to the rest of the business, rather than holding the responsibility themselves. In practical terms, it takes a long time to move from a security have the responsibility model to dishing that out across the various different departments. Tone from the top, as somebody said in the chat, is very, very important. If you don't have that, it will be very difficult to put that across. But it's not the only thing. I think there's the tone from the top, and then the real accountability models. So what are people being measured on in their organization? What is important to them when they come to their end of year reviews? Is it just about the profit, the business, the numbers of customers, whatever it is? Or is there an element of responsibility that's real, tangible responsibility that matters to them in their job role, around keeping their customers safe, keeping the data safe, keeping the business safe, keeping the business running? If you can get that into some kind of performance metrics or role, the part of their role, that helps massively. And then the other side is around the education. So how do you really help them to do this? It's all very well telling them, you must do this, you are now responsible for this. But this is something, may well be something completely new to them. It's a scary world. I think even in technology, we understand how complex technology can be. If you're outside of technology, that it feels like a whole different language, a whole different world it might be quite scary to suddenly feel I'm responsible for this. So it's giving them some simple ways of doing that. And in the supplier-client relationship, it might be that you give them a set of, I don't know, 3 or 4 questions that say, and they don't have to be in security language. They can be things like, what will happen if this supplier can't provide the service for a day, a week? And you get them to articulate that, think through that problem. What kind of data does the supplier have access to? Can the supplier see our customer data? It's using words that the business understand, and then if they think through those problems and they see something that might worry them, then you give them the channels to easily get support with that. And you frame it in a way that is support, rather than, oh, then it's bad and you can't use this supplier. It has to be in this enabling, supportive way. And not in a technical security language. It has to be in that business language.
Thanks, Emily. And George, you've been into lots of organisations, as you mentioned before, after there's been a big issue. They haven't been resilient. They haven't been able to get back on their feet very quickly. And actually, to an extent, what you're doing right now at TravelX, they need to then do a look across across the piece and improve not just the controls that they might have in place, but probably the culture of security within the organization, and then that real focus on business continuity and how you get back up and running really quickly. Just quickly, just to link this back to what both Tony and Emily have said, in those roles and when you've been doing that, do you open up that conversation to competitors or the rest of the industry to try and work out, okay, what are others doing to make themselves more resilient, and also to share intelligence? Because obviously, if you swoop in to help an organization out, you kind of need to get the context. I think some of our audience would be really interested to learn how that process works.
Yeah, a couple of good questions, Ash. I think being open to competitors is, you know, it's a place where you want to get to. In the early days of trying to recover, you're just too busy to talk to anybody. You know, and even the companies I have helped, you know, they've had customers, so you know, always been in the supply chain. And even Travelex has corporate customers that want to understand what's going on. So I think, you know, the organisation kind of has to embrace communication, certainly up and down the supply chain, and treat it as a business issue. Certainly in the critical national infrastructure areas, you know, there are sharing forums sponsored by NCFC, and there are sharing forums across regulatory environments, certainly in the financial sector. And I'm sure there's, you know, shared risks in oil and other industries that, you know, share shipping, and, you know, one day the ship full of oil belongs to BP, the next day it belongs to Shell, the next day it belongs to somebody else, you know. So the asset is completely dynamic in its nature. So there has to be some kind of sharing across the sectors, both in terms of what's the intelligence and also in terms of what's the best response for a sector. Certainly, I spent a few years chairing a group of investment banks in the business continuity space, and they worked really hard to share both intelligence and their strategies, I guess, not necessarily their plans, but and the real purpose was to make sure that, you know, the sector was evolving at a pace which was in line with regulatory expectations, and also to help firms avoid overspending in particular areas. So you get a risk view across the sector rather than an individual organisation. So I think there's massive benefits in doing that. But I think most people will know of the information sharing forums in their sector, and certainly in the regulated industries.
Thanks, George. I'm just going to turn to time's running, so I'm going to turn to some of the questions in the chat. One's a bit of a point. So this is from Heath. On the point on what we traditionally term IT, I think we need to start labeling it as digital. Businesses are starting to really understand digital transformation. We need to leverage that to drive awareness that pretty much everything, even skip lorries, I think in reference to Tony's point, have digital exposure. And I'll add my own bit on that. If we look at the pipeline cyber attack in the US, as I understand it, that ransomware affected their IT systems, and but those IT systems were really important to actually keeping that pipeline running. And so you saw a piece of critical national infrastructure there taken offline, with, you know, really to this very point. And I just want to direct a question to Emily. It's a discussion that I know we've had in the office, and we're having as Risk Ledger as a whole, is that at the moment, lots of organizations are managing third-party risks among their most critical and important suppliers. That there could be, payment providers, those types of suppliers. But actually, there is a real case to be reviewing a much broader set of suppliers to understand, just to understand where they're at and what the risk is of them sort of being taken offline by a relatively unsophisticated attack. So it'd be really good to get your views there, Emily, on how organizations who do have limited resources can manage that tension between their whole supply chain and then obviously those the limited resources on the other side.
Yeah, this is, I think this is a bit of a mindset shift. I think previously we've done the categorizing your suppliers first and then reviewing the ones that you've deemed to be important, which I think came out of necessity. There's just limited time and resource. You cannot look at everything. But now with the developing technologies we've got out there, and the risk-related platform is a great example of this, you do have the ability to review much more, or at least gather the data on much more, and allow technology to help you in analysing that data. So the way that I think we need to flip that around, we need to be gathering, make the pipe much wider at its intake, gather data on a much wider group of suppliers, and then use technology to help us narrow that down to the things that might be the biggest risk to our business, which takes into account not just the criticality of the suppliers, but the risk, the likelihood of them being attacked and the risk that they open you up to. So by using a platform that does that hard manual work for you, you're not using spreadsheets and having to look at this data and manually analyze it for every single supplier. You're then able to look at not just the critical ones, but the ones that could pose a risk. And like Ash was saying, it could be that one of your smaller suppliers, and it might be a skip provider that you think it's not going to ruin my business if that's not available for a couple of days. But it might be that they have much lower level of security and are much more open to attacks, and specifically things like ransomware, which are a big kind of widespread, just spray it out and see who you get. These smaller suppliers are much more vulnerable to that. In traditional third-party risk management programs, you wouldn't have looked at those at all. You wouldn't have even considered the risk of one of those not being available, or of them having a breach of some kind, because you didn't have the capacity to do so. Now I think that capacity is there because of the tools and the technology we've got, but it needs that mindset shift from doing the criticality analysis first and then looking at the risk. And instead, we need to be looking at the risk and then analysing the ones that really matter.
That's a really interesting viewpoint, and there's another question on the chat. It was directed at Emily, but I'm actually going to redirect to Tony. So the question said, Emily, do you think that CISOs are generally more focused on the technical aspects as opposed to approaching from the business point of view, i.e. CISO as opposed to CRO, Chief Risk Officer? And actually, because we at RiskEdge, we are working with a number of water companies, and I can say actually the makeup of the teams that we're working with is quite different from each one. Procurement in some, IT services in the other. When it comes to actually trying to manage security across an organization, first, Tony, what is your experience at Northumbria in past experiences? But where do you think it needs to be? Because it feels like there are some organizations or some sectors, in fact, as a whole, who are still trying to mature when it comes to where security sits within the organization. And then actually, it's not just security. When we're looking at third-party security, how do you rise that up to the rest of the senior managers to make sure that they are really taking that into consideration when their teams and their departments are taking actions?
Yeah, I think traditionally what's happened is that role, CISO, most people within that role come from a technical background. You know, it's still a relatively new role in the world of business. And to understand it, to get underneath the bonnet and be able to challenge people, I do think you need a level of technical ability or experience behind you, but it is a business role 100%. Emily mentioned earlier there about you know, being an advisory body. That's where my team sit. We don't do the operational day-to-day support on any of this. I also saw the question there about digital, which is something that, you know, we try to get across, but it can be quite difficult because you're talking to people in different parts of the business, and some of them still blink out in the CIT or the COT, or in some cases IoT, as we call it, where you've got a guy in the leisure team where we've got cabins next to lakes, and he's bought some treadmills with, you know, Internet Explorer, YouTube on there, and wants to plug them into the network so people can jog and watch YouTube, but doesn't realize they're still running Windows XP on those treadmills he's just bought. So it's definitely 100% a business role. You need to understand the business pressures. You need to understand other business risks, so you can know where to, or you know where to invest, and have those conversations with other people in the business who don't understand the technical parts of it. I quite often say my job's a bit an interpreter. So it's getting rid of all that technical speak and then selling it to the business in a way, and also telling the techies and the project managers and all the other work that's going on, this is how it is from a business perspective. This is what you need to think about, because every business is different as well. The risks to the business, the amount of money we have to invest will be very different. I think somebody once said there's probably more IT security or digital security people who work for one of the banks than there is right across the entire water sector. I think that's changing now. Is you know, our businesses have become more digitally mature. I'm trying to think what the second part of your question was, Ash.
No, that you I think you've covered all of it. To be fair, it was really that question of sort of the technical CISO versus someone who's more looking across the whole business. Now, George, in your experience, so I want to start to wrap this up. So we've looked today at some really specific insights into risk controls across the supply chain ecosystem, and our audience on the call are probably third-party risk managers themselves or care about supply chain security. So we've got that set of data. There are some things that jump out at you. How would you prioritize if you're looking at that information and you're looking at some of those reports? If you have that specific data for your supply chain, how would you prioritize sort of the building of resilience in that supply chain? Because this is something that we see actually clients of RiskLedger, that everyone's got a different view on how they actually use this data once they've got it. It would be really interesting to get your insights there.
Yeah, that's really good, and I think it points to the questions and discussions we've just been having. So, you know, when I think about what's the role of the CISO, what's the role of the risk manager, and so on, you know, there's a lot of lack of clarity across lots of organizations. You know, CISO is responsible for security, the CIO is responsible for IT, but the reality is, you know, you really got to establish what the responsibilities, accountabilities, you know, the rating matrix for managing the supply chain. You know, security doesn't manage suppliers; that's procurement's job. Yeah, so you consult and inform. You're not responsible, and you're not accountable. You know, in some ways, it feels more like a compliance role, whereas the CISO probably has the accountability. So actually, getting the organisation to understand that is a good step. Secondly, to kind of make change, security has to be a partner of IT, of procurement, of the other functions. So whoever's running security, whether it's a CISO or head of security, needs to be seen as a peer of those functions, and therefore part of the leadership team is about making decisions across the organisation which make sense for the organisation. Right? You're not going to make friends with anybody in the organisation as a security guy by saying implement these 147 controls by tomorrow afternoon, or you get that a red pen through your homework or something. It really is now, I think, it's about leadership across the organisation, driving around business outcomes, looking at the risks, talking with the business managers. Who do you rely on for service, for data? What do you worry about? What happens if it all falls over? As Tony and others have said, really turning the security conversation into this is what we need to do to meet the business objectives in security. And the answer is not spend another £10 million on technology. It's actually about building the internal channels that remove the barriers to doing security well.
Excellent. Thank you, George. And can I get a final thought from you, Emily, as well? So it's that the real question on what we're trying to discuss here is, all right, you've got this information. If you're lucky enough to get that sort of control by control, granular detail into what your supply chain's doing, how would you advise people to prioritize dealing with or taking the next steps from that data?
Yeah, I think to answer that, tying together a lot of what we've been talking about is the key here. It's not looking at that control by control necessarily. It's looking at the trends, looking at the real risk to the business, talking to your business, talking to your teams. This data, I think, often comes into the security team, whereas it should be coming into those business owners, whoever it is that has the relationship with those suppliers. So having those conversations, there's nice, easy tools and ways you can use to help kind of filter and funnel this. So approve those suppliers that you've done that on and you're happy with. Focus on the ones that you're not so happy with, and you need to have that communication, that conversation. If there's barriers there, you find the things you have in common, the ways, the motivations of those suppliers and your internal teams that you can relate to, you can bring them on the journey with you. I think there is some legwork to be done from security teams to bring people into that mindset. I think looking at the chat here, we all kind of agree with each other. We have similar views on how this should be and what needs doing. The challenge now is to go and take that out to other functions, other areas of the business, other organizations that are not as security focused or don't have this kind of risk business mindset, and bring them on the journey. Go and speak to them, understand their point of view, and help them to feel comfortable in this space.
Thanks, Emily. And from Tony, a slightly different question, actually. So within your role, I think what we've seen is that George and Emily have both discussed how actually there are other teams that could be leading on third-party risk management, procurement, in some cases compliance, in other cases at a water company. Obviously you're subject to the NIS directive, the GDPR. How does that work for you in terms of bringing certainly third-party risk management, but probably wider security to the top of mind for your colleagues, and management where you are? Because that we've seen, and that's what the rest of the panel has said, that's really important. If you're going to do this properly and think holistically about it, you need that buy-in from the rest of the organization. How does that work for you?
I'm fortunate enough to have really good relationships with our exec senior managers. I get around a lot. I go to a lot of senior level meetings, talk about where the risks are, explain things. I've been doing it for a few years now. Well, one thing I changed my approach, I think it was back in about 2015. Instead of just hammering on about business risk and cyber security, where you see people switching off a bit. I went through a hearts and minds process trying to engage people with cyber security, so they became interested in it. I taught them about things that they probably didn't know and try to make it a little bit sexy, I suppose, but also we do a lot of outreach to employees' families and friends, and talk about everything from cyberbullying to what the dark web is and why their kids are getting into bother at school for buying fake IDs to get into the pubs when they're only 15 years old. And people don't really understand this stuff. There was the security at work, and then there was this other stuff that went on, and by explaining what it is, what it's about, it can be a really interesting subject, or it can be a really dry subject. And I think if you do make it interesting, people get interested in it. But the other important thing is also sharing those events and incidents that happen. Quite often a company won't want to spend money until something happens. The next best thing for somebody like myself is for it not to happen to us, but to happen to somebody else. There was an incident in, I think it was January, February, water company in America got hacked, and you could see the guy in the control room could see the hacker changing the amount of sulfuric hydroxide, I think it was, that they were putting into the water, changing from 10 parts per million to 11,000 parts per million, which pretty much poisons the water. Those little stories, going and selling them, but not in a scare way. I think execs and senior managers, they've heard enough scare stories now. What they want to do is they want to understand what's the impact. Don't come here and just scare us. Come here, tell us what's going on in the world, and tell us how we can improve. And they are getting the supply chain part of it, going out and selling. For me, one of the biggest parts I like is the collaborative piece, not just internally, but where we're working on risk register, and we've got our procurement people on there, and we've got our, we're starting to show it to our account managers and project managers and saying, look, this is very important, this element. But also with the other companies, so the water sector companies, where we do use similar supply chain, and can we put pressure on? There's a huge outreach piece of work going on. There has been for years, where we're just dipping into all these different areas, trying to sell the story, trying to encourage people. That's the biggest element. And if you get that right and get everybody on board, I think you're onto the right thing. You're never going to solve everything. You're never going to have everything secure, and you can only do so much. But that for me is the way forward.
Thank you so much, Tony, and actually thank you to all of the panel for that this discussion. I hope everybody who's been on the event and been listening to you has been able to sort of answer some of their questions. We do have a final question from Frank. I wasn't going to close it down, but I'm keen to get to Frank's question, because it links to I guess the model that we use at RiskLedger. Frank says, I'm currently getting a stream of supplier requests for us to sign off declarations around ethical business behaviors. Is it time for suppliers and clients to do the same, but now for digital security? So could potentially have a little bit more context there, but I do know that one of the issues with the traditional third-party risk management program is, who is actually giving us this information? How good is this information? And how do I know it's that good? And Tony just talked about how working with other water companies and reviewing the same or similar supply chains, actually you get almost a crowdsourced supplier assessment and an industry-wide picture of particularly the critical suppliers. So I will do a quick round just as the last question, just because we do have a little bit more time. On that point that Frank made, and it goes down to that relationship with the supplier and how you get them to respond and collaborate on the process. Top tips for getting supplier engagement? Let's start with Emily, because I know we've had this conversation before.
Yeah, I think on the ethical business behaviours, this is something that's currently top of mind for people with sustainability and corporate responsibility and everything that comes along with that. So it's almost leveraging that, understanding what people are currently worried about, and apply it to whatever we need to do, apply it to security. So in Risk Ledger, we're mainly focused on security, but there's other things in there as well that we know are important between that supplier and client relationship. So we use that as one, so that everybody has that information in one place and can assess it in context with each other, but also it engages the various different teams on the things that they're interested in and they care about, and gets them into one place to have that discussion. I was actually thinking, Ash, I don't want to put you on the spot here, but it would be really useful to have this discussion across different business teams. So if we could have a discussion like this with somebody from a procurement team, somebody in other business functions, and rather than us just talking about it from a security perspective, talk about it from a business perspective. Does this work? Do the ideas we're coming up with here, do they match with what the business wants and needs and what their motivations are? And I wonder if, just from some of the conversations in the chat, I wonder if there are some people that you can think of within your own businesses that might be useful to have that discussion with. And it sounded like there was some good practice going on in some of your organizations. So I'd be really interested in that.
Sounds like a great idea, and I think I'll nick it. As you said, we do have risk domains on the our standardized assessment that do look at financial risk, that do look at procurement risk. So actually our next webinar, which will be in 3 months, perhaps we could bring those domains into the fold along with security to have that cross team conversation. George, top tips for actually getting suppliers to engage with this process in a good quality way.
Yeah, I guess there's two parts to it. Supplier selection is, a good place to start. So, choose suppliers that, map your own ethics and standards and culture. If it's a pound per point type of service you want, then you're going to only engage on pounds and points. You're not going to engage on some of these things. So, I think there's a vendor selection needs to be more informed, particularly these days with the cyber risks, GDPR, and other regulations. So choose suppliers with the right mindset. I'm a bit of a cynic on policies, so I argue sometimes that security policies are there to defend the organisation from its employees, and the same with these things like these extra agreements. You probably need them because you're in a bad place and you've done something wrong in the past. So you change the way you do things. For me, it's going back and having those conversations, and I don't think anybody in security is going to sign off on ethical behaviours document. That's going to be somebody in the business, right? So again, it's another opportunity for business leaders to talk to the suppliers to agree ways of working that work for both companies.
Thanks, George. And Tony, you already mentioned that you are working with procurement and others in Northumbrian on the third-party risk management piece. Is that something that was established before, or is that something that you've been able to do given your experience and those relationships that you said you built across the organisation?
It was happening to some extent. What was difficult was the manual processes involved in it, and the gaps as well. So this helps us bring things together. It helps us all have that holistic view of what's going on with our supply chain. It's still a work in progress, but it is something that we're looking to develop and work with each other to improve. I've just noticed his question there, and he's spot on. We do want all our supply chain. Everybody wants our supply chain to be as secure as possible. So anything we can do is going to help our own organisation. Having those conversations with the supply chain, getting them to buy into it is vital.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all of the panel. We're going to wrap the discussion up there. For those who are watching who are new to RiskEdge, I'm just going to recap how the platform works, just so that you can understand some of the comments that were made, particularly by Tony, whose team do use RiskEdge to manage their cyber security risks in their supply chain. So organizations, suppliers can complete a standardized supplier assessment on the RiskEdge platform. This is an assessment we built with the support of the National Cybersecurity Centre, and it covers 12 risk domains. And what we say is that that assessment covers what's a good base level of risk management for an organization. And the innovation of RiskEdge is that supplier can then share access to that assessment with any client that requires them to complete sort of due diligence, whether that be on onboarding, so that tends to be done by the procurement teams, or on sort of an annual review from a security team. And what we've done, we've brought that all together and we've cut out those annual reviews, because once your supplier has completed an assessment, it is continuously monitored by the platform, so that in Tony's position, for example, once their suppliers are on the platform, he can actually just measure the delta and manage the priority risks that is spotted from the information that he's collected. And that goes to some of those collaborative questions that we spoke about earlier, whether that be within the organization, so it's security, procurement, compliance can all be on the platform, looking at the same data and getting what they need from it, but then also across industries. So as Heath has mentioned on the chat, I think he's at BP. BP may share some of their supply chain with Northumbrian Water and with Thames Water, and actually on the platform with all three of them reviewing the same supplier, you can then create a race to the top in terms of security and make it a bit less of a cost. And as Tony mentioned earlier, something that they can use to go out and win more business if they've got a good security risk management regime in place. So that's just to give you a bit of context on some of the comments that were made. Thank you so much for joining. I've actually really enjoyed this discussion and learned a lot. I really appreciate Tony, Emily and George for sharing their thoughts and their expertise. For those who are interested to learn a little bit more about how RiskEdge works, I'll be sending around an email after this event that you can reply to, and I can introduce you to the right people to get a demo of the platform. But most importantly, this isn't a sales pitch, it's really about sharing some of those unique data insights that we're able to pull from the platform. So if you haven't already, in that email that I send around, please do subscribe. We do these reports every month. We put a lot of effort into getting those reports out to you, and we want it to be useful for you, because if you don't yourself in your positions have access to that control by control data or those kind of wider combined insights, we hope that this information can at least guide you towards making some good decisions and really helping to make your supply chain more resilient. So if there are no more questions and no more points, I will end the event. I wish you all a very happy day. Hopefully we'll get a little bit of sun by the end of the week. But do enjoy the rest of your day, and hope to see you soon. We do these events every quarter. So next quarter, as I mentioned, maybe we can bring together some procurement, compliance and security professionals all together to have that discussion. Okay, thanks so much, guys. Take care.
Josh, bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Take care.